Today is Friday, September 11th, 2020. My name is Jackie Pelota, and I'm here interviewing Cyn Torres for the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Please know that this interview will be placed in the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection at the University of Texas at Austin.
Okay.
If there's anything you do not wish to answer or talk about, I will honor your wishes. Also, if there's something you want to talk about, please bring it up and we'll talk about it. Because we're not conducting this interview in person, I need to record you consenting. So I'll ask you a series of 5 questions. Please say, yes, I agree, or no, I do not agree after each one. But there are 2 questions that we need to make sure you agree to before we go on. Voces wishes to archive your interview along with any other photographs and other documentation at the Benson Library at UT Austin. We will retain copyright of the interview and any other materials you donate to Voces. Do you give Voces consent to archive your interview and your materials at the Benson Library?
Yes, I agree.
Do you give Voces consent to archive your interview and your materials, any materials you provide, and grant Voces copyright?
Yes, I agree.
Do you agree to allow us to post this interview on the internet where it may be viewed by people around the world?
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. So we also have many questions in the pre-interview form that we already filled out. We use that information from the pre-interview form to help in research. The entire form is kept in a secure Voces server, and before we send it to the Benson Library, we would have stripped out any contact information for yourself or family members. So that will not be part of your public file. Your public file will only be accessible at the Benson Library. Do you wish for us to share the rest of your interview in your public file available to researchers at the Benson?
Yes.
On occasion, Voces receives requests from journalists who wish to contact our interview subjects. We only deal with legitimate news outlets. Do you give consent for us to share your phone numbers or your email with journalists?
No, I'd rather not.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you, Cyn. I appreciate you bearing with me. I know it's long and kind of dry, but it's super important, especially during this time via Zoom where we can't be together in person. But well, we can get started by having you just share with me a little bit about yourself.
Oh, I hate that question. But yeah, so I'm Cynthia or Cyn Torres. I currently work for Love 146 as a survivor care social worker. It's an anti-child trafficking org. I do a lot of organizing in my community, mostly around funding for education and like police accountability or police partnership, I guess, whatever sounds better or more palpable. Yeah, and I was born and raised in Bridgeport, and I've spent most of my time here. I was a teacher here for 4 years. I'm hoping to get into more policy work. That's like my long-term goal. I just really think like systemic change needs to come from folk who live here and who care about here. Yeah, so I think that's just been a big part of my story, and my involvement for like what's happening in the community and like even my work now. Yeah.
So you said that you're involved with not only your job as a social worker, but then also in organizing. How has your work been impacted by COVID?
Like organizing or like my work?
You can start with whichever one you'd like to start with.
Yeah, I think on the front for in terms of organizing, we wanted to be sensitive about what was happening. Like people are losing jobs and people are like, especially in the beginning of COVID when we didn't know we still don't know what's going to happen, but I think in the beginning we were trying to be really sensitive, and like had like a whole year's plan. Everything kind of got tabled, and I think after the death of George Floyd, we kind of picked things back up because, I think the community needed it. We needed to have some kind of like involvement. and like we were present before, so it was cool to like have a segue where we felt like we were responding to the community instead of telling the community how to respond. And I think like in terms of work, we were virtual for a really long time. I want to say we've been in the pandemic for 6 months, probably 4 months. We were doing virtual. I think my job did a really good job of showing up for our families that we work with. So like we've been able to provide support along like financial, food, and we're still checking in with our youth, like our caseloads. We were still getting, I think, if we had a space in our caseloads, getting assigned new clients. One of our services were postponed, but now we're back. We've been back in the field for 2 months. I think our services look a little different. I always say like I hang out with kids. That's my job. And I'm still going out and seeing my youth, but like I have to meet them outside. I have to meet them usually at their house because they're kids and their parents really can't bring them everywhere. Before, like I would go to like Dave and Buster's or go to like an art shop or like honestly anything a kid wanted to do, we would do. So that was my day before, and now it's like, hey, let's be outside. And now like we're really getting into the work, and like it's not as fun. So like some of my kids are like, oh, you're here to talk about feelings again, and now it feels very therapeutic, where before I think it was like an alternative to therapy, or like an alternative therapeutic, I don't know, release. Yeah, so I think that's changed. I think the dynamics, I'm lucky that I had a full caseload prior, so my youth all knew me already. I already had a really good rapport with all of them, so I think we're all just kind of sticking it through right now, even though it is less fun, which sounds weird, but I think that's just kind of how you get to teenagers, right? Like you just have to have fun. They have to like you and trust you. So I've been lucky to have that experience already, and then kind of keep going doing that work with them. And then, like I said, with in terms of the community, I think for a while we were trying to be cognizant of where they were at, and now it's more like, hey, like we can do things, like we can. So we had like I think a socially distanced protest, and it was like interesting to see how many people still showed up and like how passionate they were about what's going on. Bridgeport is messy, and yeah, like right now our chief of police got arrested because of the FBI, and he just resigned all within the last 24 hours. So like it's been cool to be part of that mix and be able to talk about it, and have like we have a presentation coming up, and so like being able to address that, like it's a living document what's happening here. Yeah.
So you mentioned about having a socially distant protest. Can you kind of share more information about that, like observations, like what did it look like? Because I mean, I'm sure you know like a lot of what has been shared about the protest during this time. You know, there are some folks that think, oh, you know, it's causing more COVID cases or whatnot. And so I'd love to kind of hear what you all planned and what it looked like.
Yeah, so honestly, it wasn't even through like the organizations that I'm a part of. It was just my friend had an idea, we kind of ran with it. It was really centered around joy. So like we kind of incorporate. There was a lot of protests happening in Bridgeport already. So we had a kind of like an art protest, and people came, made signs, did chalking, we had paint, we had any kind of art form we had. We I think all our friends donated money collectively. Between like the 8 of us, we raised almost $1,000. And with that money, we bought like protective gear. Like everyone had to wear a mask. We provided masks. We provided hand sanitizers. We were cleaning material. Like it was just, we had like our different areas set up, and just make sure people were keeping distance from each other. And if like I mean, some of us were already around each other. Yeah, and I would say we maybe had about 50 people come through the span of like 3 hours. So I don't think there's ever more than 35 people at a time there, because we had such a big window. And then, I mean, it was good. Like I think people were really respectful of each other and respectful of. We did it in front of the police station. The police were fine. We had legal observers, so I think it was a good space. It was open. And nothing came of it where anyone had to take off their mask or do anything. And because we had like those precautions of like a mask and like we were wearing gloves and sharing, we had Lysol everywhere. I think it was, like I said, it was really centered around joy, and I think no one really wanted to ruin that. And it was about us, about our community and healing. And that was first, second, and third. So I think like it was the first time a lot of us, or even like myself, my friends, had seen each other at that point, what, in 3 months. So I think it was really tiring the next day, but it was really empowering to see like our community really wanting to center like healing and bring some joy back into the space, because so much is taken from us, and I think like so many of us are tired. I think that kind of answered your question.
Yeah, y'all were really prepared. I don't think I've heard or seen something like that. So thanks for sharing your about your experience with that.
Yeah, I think like other organizations, I don't know who at this point, but they had like donated stuff, like if we got tear gas, like baking soda, milk. It was just a lot. Like people were dropping off materials just because like if there was a protest happening the day before, like whatever was left over, they brought to us, and we did the same thing. We donated, I think we donated like $300 to a family, and one of our families in our city, one of the projects got burned down, so we donated some money to them, and we're using the rest of the money to have another actual like a social distance like trunk or treat for the kids. Just because going back to school has sucked. Like these poor kiddos are just being robbed of everything, and we get like why. So hopefully, if the cases stay the way they are in Connecticut, we can have like a socially distanced trunk or treat and like do it like that.
So you talked about, I mean, I know you're no longer a teacher anymore, but still being really involved within the education system. You said that I guess the overall start of this school year has sucked. Can you, I guess, elaborate more on that? Because I mean, the states, they are doing this very different, right? And so, yeah, can you speak more to what's happening in Bridgeport?
Yeah. So in Bridgeport, you had a choice. If you're K through 8, you had a choice. They either are online completely or in person. So my sister is doing online, but she is like basically like FaceTiming her teacher. So she's in the class, like in the same classroom she would be if she was in class. So some of her friends are in school, so she kind of sees them when she's on camera with her teacher. So her teacher kind of like this is like teaching, but has actual kids in front of her and has kids online. So these teachers are being overworked to, I don't even know what degree. Her teacher's been really great. I will say that. Like she's like, hey, if she's overwhelmed, she can log off. Like I think there's a lot of grace being extended. At least that's my experience with my sister's teacher. High school, they're doing a hybrid. So some kids are going to school Monday and Tuesday, and then everyone's virtual on Wednesday, and then the rest of them are going Thursday, Friday. I'm not really sure how that's going for my brother right now. I think it's his senior year, so for him, like going to school in person was really big, understandably. So I'm not sure how that's going. I know for my sister, it's hard. Like the technology in Bridgeport is not. I mean, they gave all the kids a laptop, which was awesome, but like she couldn't hear the teacher one day, and that had nothing to really do with technology. It was just like the teacher was too far from the computer, right? Because she has real kids in front of her that she has to teach too. So they're trying to utilize like some websites online to help. I think they're using ReadWorks, which I'm sure you remember, to like assign assignments that can automatically grade. I think teachers are doing the best that they can with what they have. But like if you see like pictures, like I know some schools are sharing pictures and the kids in the school look so sad, and the desks are so, I don't know, it just doesn't feel, I think low income schools already allude to feeling like a prison, and I think now with COVID it just feels like that even more.
Being kind of involved in organizing, has there been anything that you all have been kind of pushing for, either on the students' behalf, but then also on the teachers' behalf? Like, are teachers feeling safe? Is there something that the school district can do for both the teachers and the students?
Yeah, I think I think I've heard that teachers can't protest here, and as part of their contract, that they could lose their job. So they haven't done anything in Bridgeport, for at least from what I hear. Um, and I think a lot of people were pushing for choice, and that's what they got with the Board of Ed. They did a survey. We helped promote some of that survey and just like sharing it. I think everything just felt so up in the air for so long that we weren't even sure what's happening. I think even now, like we feel like the schools are gonna close. I think 3 of our neighbor like towns have already closed due to COVID cases. So I feel like we're next, just to keep kids safe and keep teachers safe. Some of my teacher friends who are still involved in, I mean, who are still teaching, um, really been quiet, and I think that has to do with like the contract and having to be quiet. But I think a lot of it has just come down to like, hey, like I'm back in work. Like, luckily, I have flex time, so I can help, and we have family who can help with my sister who's doing the virtual. But like the reality of Bridgeport and cities like Bridgeport, parents don't have a choice when it comes back to work. So they have to go to work and the kids have to go somewhere, right? So I think that's kind of been the narrative here, and just like that choice, that option, which luckily we do have.
Can you share more about what you just said about like specifically in Bridgeport, parents not having a choice, because I mean, I know a little bit about Bridgeport just having been in Connecticut, but other folks might not. So if you can
Yeah.
speak to that.
So, well, Bridgeport is predominantly, I guess, low income. I don't know if that's politically correct, but I think everyone, when the first wave of COVID was happening in Connecticut, I mean, the first reopening phase of COVID was happening in Connecticut, right? Like who was going back, like essential workers. A lot of those essential workers are the parents I used to teach. They're working in fast food industries, they're working in direct service. So I think like, if, to me, it feels a little experimental, right? To put like our most at-risk people back into work. Um, Aside from like the people who've been on the front lines all along, but you're sending people back to work to make minimum wage, and I think that's what happened in Bridgeport for the first phase. When we looked at what was opening, and like you have to, like, people were unemployed, people want to go back to work, and like even understanding the risk, like I think like at that point, because the lack of governmental assistance, people were going back. um I know a lot of families, like my families I used to teach, um, like reached out about like how can they apply for this, and like they didn't qualify for unemployment. And if you know anything about unemployment, like it's not like a super elaborate reason why, they just tell you no. And then like getting through to anyone's super difficult. So I think a lot of people, I think the narrative that's being assigned, that typically gets assigned to like low income folk, wasn't always true, and people were really struggling for resources. So people were back working months ago, even before I was back at work. And like, they need childcare, and childcare is really expensive. And a lot of folks, a lot of families rely on school to send their kids back to, so that they can have somewhere safe for their kids to be and like be engaged. And then like we don't have citywide Wi-Fi here, so like virtual is not an option for everyone. Sorry, I live in the hood. So like going to school in person is a necessity for a lot of folk. And I think that's kind of what we were seeing. And like, that's why that choice is so important, because families have to like really coordinate and prioritize, like, hey, what are they doing? Why are they doing that? Because it just wasn't, it's not always, I mean, having a choice is good in theory, right? But for some families here in Bridgeport specifically, the choice meant like, I need to send my kids back because I don't have a choice. And everyone else who has like the flexibility does. Yeah.
And you said that it's Bridgeport is predominantly or mainly low income. Demographically speaking, what would you say the makeup of the city is?
I'm not sure, like, demographic. I know we're all like, probably say like 75% brown and black. There are pockets of wealth here. But I would say like out of the four sides, like the west, north, east, and south, all of them, three-fourths of those would probably be all multifamily brown and black folk.
And you talked about the difficulty, for folks in trying to get unemployment, people not qualifying. Were there any other things that you all were trying to organize for, or because I know some cities like had their own kind of like CARES Act type thing, or any sort of aid to support the community?
We personally, like, we weren't, I think we talked about it, but it just felt like capacity, like what could we don't have money ourselves, like it really was hard. I know mutual aid in Bridgeport became a thing, like I volunteered with them, like dropping off groceries. I don't really know like the logistics behind that. And I know that one of the smaller faith-based organizations in Bridgeport had reached out to families for like grocery gift cards, and that happened twice. But I don't really, like, besides mutual aid and besides like that organization, I don't really know what else was happening or what other resources were available to families. Like, we suck here. Like, there wasn't, like, the city itself didn't respond. Wow.
Do you feel like in that response, that there like a response for any sort of like safety precautions? Like, what were the cases kind of like in Bridgeport, and did the city do anything to support the cases, and then also support the folks like you mentioned that had to kind of go back earlier than others?
I think like there was a lot of communication around, like, we have two hospitals in Bridgeport. Like, what was the bed count in terms of like available beds? Like, oh, if you're sick, or like the precautions to take were available. Like, if you had excuse me, COVID symptoms, like what to do, where to go if you didn't and you still need to go to the hospital, like what was that? I think that was pretty clear. And like that daily update, there was something like on Facebook Live from our mayor. But other than that, I feel like everyone was really on their own. Like, you really had to know what pages to follow, who to ask questions to. But I think that's so like on brand for Bridgeport. Like, you need to know what to do in order to get assistance here, and that was kind of what happened with COVID too. Like, unless you were sick, like, or even if you were sick, you had to kind of figure out who to call and like what to do on your own. Um, Unless I missed like a giant memo that I didn't get. I mean, it's possible. I don't think like I'm an all exhausted resource like person, but I do think like I'm involved, and I didn't really hear anything. I think when it came back to like going back, they did small things. Like, I think parking, like the meter parking downtown Bridgeport has been free until like I think yesterday. And we have maybe 10 businesses downtown. Like, it's not a booming downtown. Even with we had an election, there was obviously a push for absentee ballots, but Bridgeport's like notorious for like absentee ballot fraud. So like people didn't really feel safe with that option. And even like there's just like like I said, we had the scandal with our chief of police. Like, they already had an induction ceremony last night for a new chief of police, and half the leaders at that board weren't even wearing masks. So like, what are we telling our kids? Like, what are we telling the community? Yeah.
Yeah. You bring up the police chief again, and I'd love to hear more about that, just because it's so recent, and I'm sure it's something that's kind of very fresh on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, what was it? The FBI found him guilty of tampering with his own hiring process, the police chief exam, and then I forgot the personnel director that was there at the time was also found guilty. So they were both arrested with like fraud charges from the FBI. But that's also the third time the FBI has been involved with something Bridgeport related. And I think like he had not a great rapport with the community, and I think that there's a lack of respect for the community. I think like, and he makes a ton of money, and I just think the way the Bridgeport PD is run like is not efficient. I think everyone knows that, even the people who work there. Yeah.
As a community organizer, and as you mentioned, like you, I guess, are trying to organize for better police partnerships, whatever that looks like. Have you all kind of proposed something? Like, what is it ideally for you all that you all want?
Yeah, so I don't want to speak too much on it yet because we haven't rolled out our plan publicly, and I'm not sure when we will. So I don't want to like go too deep into it. But negotiations are happening in terms of like the police contract. So I think that's where we're focusing on. I think like everything else we found, like research finding, like it's not like us. Like I think has shown that it has to come like from a contract level. About and what does that look like? Because right now, like the police contracts have there's the ACLU, the Connecticut ACLU released a report. It's called Bargained Away. It's really good, and it just kind of highlights like the issue with the police unions and the police contract right now, that we've given them like all the power. Like we tell them there's no consequences, they're protected by the union, and like unions are great. Like I was part of the union as a teacher, and yes, they show up for you, but like as a police officer there's certain liabilities that I think like need to happen, and there should be a level of accountability, right? They can't just wreak havoc on the community. Like police, like if I don't know if you heard the car that was zooming by, that was a police officer. That's not a community, a constituent. That's just a police officer who doesn't live in Bridgeport doing whatever he wants, and that's very on brand. Like that happens all the time. We had like myself had an issue where the police had to come to my house during like probably in the midst of COVID, and it was 3 police officers that popped up, and they were like, "Oh, it's COVID protocol." Like at 2 a.m. for you to pop up in my house, like I live alone. Like it just didn't like for it was like a dog thing, and I was like, that doesn't even make sense. Like, and I think like there's just that. Yeah, so I think right now we're just really pushing for, at this point there needs to be some accountability in their contracts, and that can be a very long process, but I think that's going to be the only way to get anything done. So that's where we're heading, and I think that's the direction we're going in. Yeah.
And you can speak more from like a personal perspective and not necessarily, I guess, part of in thinking about your organizing work, but do you personally think that the partnership can be salvaged? Because I'm sure you, I mean, again, you being part of a lot of the organizing and protests, you see protests that say, like just get rid of the police, altogether. So what do you think?
Me personally, I think we need to defund the police. Like that's just how I feel. I have family and I have friends who are police officers, not here in Bridgeport, but I feel very firm that we need, especially Bridgeport police last year. I think they had maybe 6 or 7 like brutality lawsuits. I might be lying about the number, but there was more than 5. And they got a 9% increase in their budget. And they're already the biggest funded part of Bridgeport's budget. And like, for what? I think everything's been so reactive. And then you look at schools, like when I was teaching, I was on a pay freeze for 2 years. So even in my third year teaching, I was still getting paid like a first year teacher. And I like even talking about what the teachers are going through right now, like I can bet you they're probably on a pay freeze. Like we don't treat teachers the way we treat like police. Police get a raise regardless of their actions, regardless of how many kids have been at the end of their brutality. Like it doesn't matter. Literally, the police could light the city on fire and we would probably still give them a raise. Like The police overtime budget is ridiculous. I don't know. I think if we really divested from the police budget and put that towards education, Bridgeport could literally do a 180. Like, we could be in such a better place. So personally, I really do think like we need to defund the police. It just, I think research shows like police don't prevent crime, they're reactive. They go to something after. I work in DV as well as a per diem, and like they rely on the social workers or the advocates to help mediate that situation. It's not even the police. I feel like a lot of the arguments for why we need them can be resolved with like resources, and police have really become gatekeepers to these public resources. So get rid of them. Well, I know I'm gonna hear somewhat backlash for that, but
No, I mean, I appreciate your voice. I think it's an important voice. And so you mentioned something about the other kind of contractual type work that you do with, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, DV is domestic violence, correct?
yes,
Yeah. And so can you speak more to that experience? Because you touched upon it a little bit, like your approach versus, you know, because people, I guess, think that, like you said, the police are the ones that are you know, like that's people say the argument, right, for police is they do a lot of other things, right? They support with domestic violence, and you're kind of saying, and like, you know, not necessarily. And can you speak more to that?
Yeah, so I think it looks different for different organizations, but for this agency, like they receive the cause of the DV, right? Especially if the victim, it's like a risk assessment, like depending on how they place on this assessment. So the cop has to call it in, gives you the details, but you're the one who follows up with the victim and like talks to them, safety plans with them, see if they need further resources. Do they need to leave? Do they need a place to stay? So I think all that planning happens afterwards, and the police, if I think the major reason why a police would be needed for some domestic violence calls is for dual arrest. And I don't know how many, or like an arrest for the perpetrator. So I'm not sure how many of them turn into arrests. Like I don't have those stats on hand. But besides the arrest, I don't, and like that immediate safety, like I think we do a lot of the parts that keep the people safe, like the safety planning, like if they need somewhere to stay. I think all of that comes from those domestic violence advocates. Give me 1 second, sorry. Yeah, so I think like that's something that people don't see. And like and I think it depends on the cop that goes to the case. It could be someone great who really will help you connect and understand like when they call us, like who we are. Or you can get a cop who is like, okay, well here's a number. If you need help, you need to call this number. Like I think I had like it's just a lot, and like a lot of that times more harm comes sometimes. Like I think people don't realize that if there's like an order of deportation for you, or and a cop comes to your house, like some of that can be triggered, which is something that's happened, and it's sad because there's no like what's the assistance, what's the help from that, like how do you recover from that? So it's hard. It's just I think there's more to the mix than people realize, especially when it comes to like things like domestic violence and like the cops' role in that.
And you mentioned something about deportation as well, and so you know, along with the abolish the police, you know, folks in protests are also saying to abolish ICE. Has that been something that has impacted your community significantly?
Yeah. So I think Bridgeport was in an interesting spot a couple, I don't know, time doesn't feel real now with COVID, but a couple months ago, in terms of like naming Bridgeport a sanctuary city or not. We do have a huge immigrant population here. And it's really mixed on where people land on that. So I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I mean, just because you mentioned, like, that might be a possibility if somebody engages with the police. And so, within the protests, not only are people saying, abolish or defund the police, but like they're also saying abolish ICE. And so I'm just wondering, has that been a big issue in Bridgeport?
I think it's come up. We do have a like immigration advocacy org here that's like based in Bridgeport that they do a lot of that work. I think it's been a big conversation. It's come up in city council. Um, but I feel like we just don't have a strong enough stance. Like I think Bridgeport's so diverse in terms of who's here. I think sometimes when people think of immigrants, they think of just like Latinos or Hispanics, like, but we have a huge like Asian immigrant population, and we have a lot of different pockets of different like immigrant groups here. Like you, any kind of food you want, you probably can find, which is what I love about my city and like I love about Bridgeport, and I think people don't realize. Sorry. Like that's what makes us so rich in like our culture and our diversity here. Um, I think like people miss that. Um, but and there's some work happening. I'm just not too like tuned into it.
And I want to go back to something that you mentioned, just kind of given that we're in September and the election is so close. You mentioned that there are concerns amongst folks, and there's been issues in the past, even with this previous election, in regards to folks participating, engaging. And so, have you all thought about anything that you all can do? For this upcoming election, since I'm sure COVID is still going to be a thing in November, and so what does that look like for you all on the organizing side?
Yeah, I think capacity is where we're at. Like we're tuned into so many things, and I think the organization as a whole is doing something, but that's not where I'm at right now. Um, I know they have like a campaign for like making a plan to vote. I think that's the direction. And I know like for the event we're trying to do the trunk or treat. We're gonna do voter registration. But that's in like my own capacity. That's not in like the organization's capacity. Um, I think something to also like highlight is that there's a difference between like community power and like organized power. And trying to have very clear distinction between those two. Um, just because there's a lot of red tape that comes with organizing if you're doing it through an official capacity through a certain org, like laws and all these things. And if you're as a community, if you're doing it and like getting people together, which is what we're hoping to do with the trunk or treat, like that's a little bit easier, and there's not as many red tape. Like we're doing it at my old school, and it's just going to be like some of my former students and us, and like I think that's a little bit less heavy. But I know like I think at least one or two campaigns I can think of like planning to vote, voting, like stressing and passing some of the knowledge around voting in person. Just because Bridgeport has such a low voter turnout anyways, like going to the polls is probably just as safe as mailing in your ballot to an extent. um so just bringing awareness around that. I know that's some of the work being done, but once again, in terms of capacity, like that's not something I'm tuning into. Just prioritizing some of the police work and some of the contract work that we've been doing, and like that's just taking a lot of time.
So I want to be respectful of your time. So I just wanted to end with this last question of if there's anything else that you would like to share with me about your experiences with COVID or kind of during this time that I've not asked about yet that you want to share.
um I don't think so. I think, yeah, I mean, I think I've been fortunate enough to have like a job, and a job that was so understanding and like responsive. And I understand that's not like always the story with everyone. So I feel like I want to name that and recognize that. Um, but I think we're all just doing the best that we can, and with the circumstances given, and like just these unknown like I hate that word, unprecedented times. Like, we don't know how long. Like, I remember my friend did a survey about how long COVID will last, and like, I think I wrote May. I was hoping for May, and here we are in September. October is about to come, New Year's about to come, and I feel like I don't think we're ever gonna go back to normal. Yeah, so I think like being gracious with where we're at, and like just hoping for like a better tomorrow and better year and good results.
Well, thank you, Cyn. I really appreciate you taking this time with me to share your experiences and stories and perspectives. I know you're hella busy, so so I really, really appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you guys doing this. This is awesome, and I'm glad to be part of it.